New Hampshire's state motto is "Live Free or Die," a slogan that captures well the political culture that has developed due to its history. To see why, join me for this brief look at the history and politics of New Hampshire. Humans first arrived in what is now New Hampshire some 12,000 years ago. From that time and until roughly 9,000 years ago, in an area archaeologists have dubbed Paleo-Indian period, temperatures were colder and large animals dominated the landscape, including caribous, which Paleo-Indians regularly hunted to complement their diet of fruits and nuts. In more recent millennia, as the weather continued to warm, the people that inhabited future New Hampshire were part of the Algonquian language group and called themselves the Abenaki, a name that translates to people of the first light. They lived in wigwams, dome or cone-shaped structures woven with birch or elm bark, and lived off of hunting and fishing, and what they dubbed the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash. They also figured out a way to tap maple trees to make maple syrup, something they ate year-round. This lifestyle began to change with the arrival of the Europeans in the 17th century. As early as 1507, Sebastian Cabot, an Italian navigator working for the British Crown, sailed along the New England coast and claimed it for them. But it would not be until 1603 for the British to attempt to assess New England's commercial potential in earnest. Funded by Bristol merchants, that new expedition consisted of 2 ships and 44 men under the command of Martin Pring, a 23-year-old Englishman from Devonshire. The crew landed first in Maine in April of that year and then made their way to the Piscataqua River by June. They would then explore New Hampshire's Great Bay, as well as the various waterways that emptied into what would become Portsmouth Harbor, the Saco, York, and Kennebunk rivers. Pring's expedition would interact with various Abenaki groups and would report back that the area had ample natural resources. Nonetheless, yet another decade would go by before another explorer showed up. This time it was John Smith, the man of Jamestown, Virginia fame, who in 1614 explored the New England coastline from Maine to Cape Cod, including a stop on the small islands lying off the New Hampshire shore. By 1620, the British were ready to attempt settlements in the region and chartered the Council of New England for the purpose. Their initial efforts were helped by the fact that, unbeknownst to the Europeans, previous encounters with the natives had transmitted disease to them. Indigenous peoples lacked any immunity to this, so its spread turned catastrophic. Historians estimate that some 75 to 90% of the people who lived within 20 miles of the coast died. Entire indigenous villages were wiped out, bringing heartbreak and disruption to the Abenaki's traditional patterns of life, including their governance structure. Further inland, the Abenaki's losses were less catastrophic but still severe. Meanwhile, the Council of New England awarded 2 different claims in present-day New Hampshire. The first was to David Thompson, who established the first year-round settlement in the future state, a commercial fishing operation in a place they called Panaway, today Odiorn Point State Park. Although profitable, the settlement was disbanded after only 4 years. Still, some of the workers opted to remain. This included 2 brothers, Edward and William Hilton, who moved inland and founded a new settlement in what is now Dover. The second grant was a huge tract of territory given in 1629 to Colonel John Mason, a former governor of Newfoundland. The land in question extended from roughly the Merrimack River north along the coast to the Piscataqua River, and then 60 miles inland, a massive area Mason decided to name New Hampshire after his family seat in Hampshire, England. The former governor first attempted a fur trapping operation, which brought some 100 men and women to the future state, spread out over several settlements. These mostly failed, but Strawberry Bank, renamed Portsmouth in 1635, thrived. In fact, it became important enough as a center of fishing, timber, and fur trading operations that it began to attract settlers from neighboring Massachusetts, many of whom were fleeing the Puritan colony's strict religious dictates. Unfortunately for the incipient prosperity of the colony, Colonel Mason died unexpectedly in 1635, just as he was preparing to travel to North America. This turned out to be a significant headache for the future of New Hampshire because it not only lost any kind of centralized leadership, but doubts about the ownership of the land discouraged further investment. Even worse, there was confusion about the boundary between it and Massachusetts, a controversy that would continue well into the 18th century. The arrival of new settlers further muddled the legal situation. One of those groups was led by John Wheelwright, a Puritan minister from Massachusetts that was banished from the Bay Colony for his independent religious views and thus turned north to found a new settlement, which he named Exeter. Wheelwright took the unusual step of purchasing a large piece of land from the local Abenaki, complete with a written deed that the Abenaki leader, Wehanawanowit, inscribed with his mark. The Massachusetts government, however, not only refused to recognize wheelwright settlement, but also encouraged a rival group of Puritans to lay claim to land in New Hampshire at a place called Winnecunet, present-day Hampton. These four towns, Portsmouth, Dover, Exeter, and Hampton, would be the primary centers of population in New Hampshire until the 1720s. Especially in their early years, they were all independently governed, and there was no overarching colony-wide government. In fact, the idea of a single New Hampshire would have been foreign to them, and there was little that bound them together. Still, although the four communities began evolving along different paths, they had a number of important characteristics in common. First and foremost was that unlike the people of Massachusetts, who came to America primarily for religious reasons, the majority of the New Hampshire settlers came to the New World seeking profit, or at least economic stability. Second was that they generally believed in participatory democracy and trusted in people to make collective decisions rather than having diktats from some higher authority. New Hampshire's legal status continued to be ambiguous, so much so that at one point Massachusetts claimed the entire future state, designating it as Norfolk County. Indeed, it was not until 1679 that King Charles combined the four New Hampshire towns into a single province, by which point there were roughly 2,000 English colonists living there. The newly established colony barely lasted as a standalone entity. In 1686, in an attempt to gain control over British North America and lower costs, King James II placed New Hampshire along with several other American colonies into a single unit known as the Dominion of New England. But then in 1688, the Glorious Revolution exploded in the UK. James was deposed, and so was the Dominion. William and Mary, the new monarchs, issued the colony a fresh charter, but Massachusetts governors would remain the authority over New Hampshire until 1741. In the meantime, the ample New Hampshire forests of chestnut, oak, and birch made the colony an important producer of lumber. It supplied both Boston and shipped overseas, including to the West Indies, Southern Europe, and England itself. Moreover, the combination of available lumber and Portsmouth's shelter harbor led to the development of a shipbuilding industry, especially the production of masts. This market, coupled with demand for furs, encouraged colonists to settle further into the interior, particularly after 1741, when the boundary dispute with Massachusetts was finally settled when the Crown ruled that the original New Hampshire land claim belonged to Colonel Mason's descendants. These people, in turn, opted to sell their claim and all the land to a group of 12 Portsmouth businessmen who became known as Masonian proprietors. The new owners wasted no time in encouraging settlement, bringing sustained immigration and development to the colony. Some of the newcomers were the Scots-Irish, who founded settlements like Londonderry and brought the widespread cultivation of potatoes and flax, the latter used in the production of fine linen. As the colonists moved into the interior, however, they came into conflict with the Abenaki and later the French, and thus the New Hampshire frontier was the scene of multiple skirmishes as part of broader conflicts for nearly a century, starting in the 1680s. The largest and ultimately decisive, however, turned out to be the French and Indian War, which took place from 1754 to 1763. Although no major battle occurred in New Hampshire soil, 1,000 of its men contributed to the war effort, including Robert Rogers, a man famous for using guerrilla-style warfare, and John Stark, a man best known for his later exploits during the American Revolution, and New Hampshire's famous motto. British victory was complete, ceding all French claims in North America to Britain, and thus ending any foreign claims on New Hampshire soil. The Abenaki were no longer a threat, and there was even an effort to educate them with the construction of Dartmouth College in 1769. But these gains also came at a cost. The war convinced the Crown that it not only needed to have tighter control over its North American possessions, but also that the colonies should defray the high administrative cost. This infuriated the colonists, particularly the Boston merchants. Given the many connections between them and New Hampshire, the colony naturally sided with its neighbor. But the future state also developed its own grievances, most notably over the cutting of pine trees. As it turns out, there was a British law dating from 1722 that prevented the cutting of white pine trees larger than 12 inches so as to reserve them for the Royal Navy. But the measure was rarely enforced. So when local authorities tried to do so in 1722, townsfolk attacked the sheriff and his deputy at the inn and where they were staying. This event came to be called the Pine Tree Riot, which is credited with inspiring the more famous Boston Tea Party in 1773. Soon, New Hampshire, along with the other 12 colonies, found themselves at war with the Crown. Long before the official start of hostilities, however, New Hampshire's government had lost much of its power. Indeed, on June 13, 1775, the governor, John Wentworth, along with his family, fled, never to return after a mob surrounded their house. This in turn prompted the future state to write a constitution that predated every other American effort. It was drafted on January 5, 1776, when New Hampshire's Congress in Exeter voted to establish a civil government, one that lacked any kind of executive or judicial branch. When the war finally came, it spared the colony of any battles on its soil, but nonetheless, New Hampshire participated fully in the American Revolution, with its men being crucial, particularly in the battles of Bunker Hill in June 1775 and Bennington in Vermont in August 1777. Hostilities ended with an American victory in 1781 and the promise of prosperity. But even before the victory came, New Hampshire was forced to write a new constitution, primarily because some of the 1776 charter flaws, like the fact that it could not be amended, were creating serious dissatisfaction among its citizens. The most significant of these were New Hampshire's western towns, which were threatening to secede and join Vermont, a territory which itself had been in dispute between New York and New Hampshire, until it managed to declare itself independent in January 1777. Thus, to solve the problem, the colony's elite opted to call for a constitutional convention to be held in Exeter in 1778, the first of its kind anywhere in the world. It was then put to the voters, who rejected it several times, until 1783, when it was finally accepted, the very state constitution that remains in effect to this day. Less than 5 years later, there was another convention, this time to ratify the U.S. Constitution. The process to get that approved was also not straightforward, but in the end it finally happened, and on June 21, 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution, joining both the United States and becoming the key vote to allow the Constitution to come into effect. The period of the early republic was one of expansion and development for the state. The New Hampshire Turnpike, the first major road, originally a private one, was built in 1796 and connected Concord to Portsmouth. 24 more would be built in the next decade. There were also canals which connected Manchester to the Boston markets, but perhaps the most important was the railroad. The first line in New Hampshire was laid in 1838, connecting Lowell and Nashville, and dozens more would follow in the 1840s and 1850s until they were gobbled up by the end of the 19th century by the Boston and Maine Railroad, which grew to dominate railroad travel in northern New England. All of this was made possible by the demand and prosperity that the American Industrial Revolution had unleashed. Initiated by Samuel Slater, a British immigrant who brought textile production technology that relied on water mills to New England, he helped build one in New Ipswich in 1803, something that would be quickly copied across the state. One of them, the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company in Manchester, would eventually become the largest cotton textile plant in the world. And it was not just textiles. There were paper mills in Bennington. Concord and Amherst became known for their furniture and clockmakers, while the Monadnock region became the center of a glass-making industry. It also attracted plenty of newcomers, especially Irish and Germans, and after 1850, French Canadians. The state's population doubled between 1790 and 1940, and then kept growing at a decent clip in the next 2 decades. New settlements were developed, especially in the Upper Valley and the North Country. As people began to develop distant lands, however, they realized that the borders with Canada were ill-defined. This confusion led some new settlers to create their own independent republic in a land that was not clearly owned by either the US or Canada. Known as the Indian Stream Republic, it had some 290 square miles and lasted between 1832 and 1835 until it was annexed to New Hampshire in August of that year, becoming present-day Pittsburgh. The rest of the border with Canada, meanwhile, was not definitively established until 1842 under the Ashburton-Webster Treaty. The shift in population also convinced New Hampshire that it needed to move its capital to Concord, a more central location that could serve the people of the state better. This was done in 1808. It was followed in 1819 by a new state house, still a symbol of New Hampshire, and the oldest capital in the nation in which the state's legislative branches meet in their original chambers. Meanwhile, just as slavery began dividing the rest of the country, New Hampshire became similarly polarized. Although Granite Staters were more sympathetic to the abolition of slavery, they were not necessarily in favor of racial equality. Thus, although it was here that one of the earliest interracial schools was established, in Canaan in 1835, and it was here that the first novel by a black woman anywhere in the country was published, a book by Harriet Wilson in 1859, the school was destroyed by anti-abolitionists, and the novel was mostly forgotten. Divisions around slavery were embodied by 2 men in particular during this period: John Parker Hale and Franklin Pierce. Friends from college, their political careers rose in parallel, ending with both contesting the 1852 presidential election as the Democratic and Free Soil nominees respectively. But while Hale became the first abolitionist senator, Pierce was sympathetic to Southern slaveholders, and when he became president, his sympathies accelerated the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. In the end, despite some misgivings among its population, when war came, New Hampshire sided decisively on the side of the Union. It sent 31,657 men to the effort. These were divided into 18 infantry regiments, the most famous of whom was the 5th, which saw action in most of the battles in the Virginia theater, including Gettysburg. Of the men that served, around 20% died. The post-war years returned New Hampshire to a path of economic growth and the diversification of manufacturing. Shoemaking became an important industry, for example, with the first shoe factory appearing in Nashua in 1874, Newport in 1887, and Manchester in 1892. Growth was particularly fast in the latter, so that by the turn of the 20th century, Manchester was known as the City of Shoes. Logging also gave way to more diversified wood products, including the manufacturing of paper. The most important of these was the Berlin Mills Company, later renamed Brown, which by the early 20th century was the world's largest chemical paper pulp mill and the biggest producer of newsprint globally. Likewise, the booming economy attracted immigrants, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe. Unfortunately, the good times were not to last. Even before the Great Depression hit in 1929, New Hampshire's economy had hit a rough patch, starting with the decline of the textile industry in the 1920s. But the Wall Street crash made things much worse. By 1931, not only was the unemployment rate in the state a staggering 33% compared to 31% nationally, but demand for agricultural products was so low that half of the farms in the state shut down. New Hampshire's governor, John Winant, did what he could, instituting programs such as a minimum wage for women and children, increasing state aid to towns and cities, passing emergency relief for dependent mothers and children, regulating the bank industry, and enacting a state roadway construction program that employed 3,000 men. None of these recovery measures, however, could save the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. Wages were cut to the bone and workers were laid off in the hopes of cutting costs. But this only resulted in violent strikes in 1933 and 1934, which in turn prompted the intervention of the state militia. By Christmas Eve in 1935, the company filed for bankruptcy and all assets were liquidated the following summer. The Amoskeag shutdown was devastating for Manchester, especially since it had controlled the economic and political life of the city for over 100 years. The rest of the state's mills would suffer the same fate in this period, leaving in their wake depressed city centers and thousands of suffering people. World War II would finally stop the bleeding, and it would also make New Hampshire the scene for a world-shaping event, the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. In that meeting, the financial and monetary New World Order was decided, and the World Bank and IMF were created. The post-war years would also completely change New Hampshire's economy. Tourism became much more important, especially skiing, which was one of the economic few bright spots during the 1930s. Today, it accounts for around 4% of the state's GDP. There was also defense spending, which would help the state move away from things like lumber and paper to computer hardware and electronics manufacturing. Sanders Associates, for example, which produced flexible circuitry for military and space programs as well as commercial uses, moved its facilities from Massachusetts to Nashua in 1952. One of the people employed there, Ralph Baer, came up with the idea around 1966 of playing games on a television screen. He would eventually create the Brown Box, the blueprint of the first home video game console. Since the 1990s, southern New Hampshire has continued to diversify and is now an important part of the worldwide biotech industry. Meanwhile, New Hampshire gained nationwide importance for a different reason. In 1920, the state started a tradition that placed New Hampshire as the first primary in the country. At the time, party conventions actually decided who the candidates would be, so this did not matter much. But as primaries became the vehicle by which people became party nominees, especially after the 1970s, the state gained disproportionate political attention, with candidates often spending months campaigning them, and breaking campaigns so often they are too numerous to mention. Partly for that reason, national parties have tried to change this first-in-the-nation primary, only for New Hampshire to refuse, with uneven results. That has brought the state full circle, from the earliest settler days when they refused to abide by others' rules to now. This same pattern has made New Hampshire the friendliest Republican state in New England, where in recent years they have dominated locally, although have repeatedly lost at the national level. But it has also brought some tensions, as citizens demand government do more, while simultaneously limiting taxation. Whether property taxes alone can sustain the growth of the state in the foreseeable future is one of the main political questions in New Hampshire today.